Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about Netflix and the robots within it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we'll be looking at, you guessed it, some Android-related Netflix content. First up, we'll be covering their sci-fi anthology Love, Death and Robots, and then we'll be watching The Mitchells vs. the Machines, a fun film about, well, a family fighting robots. So yeah, a lot of robots to come, but first, Alistair, what have you consumed in the last 2 weeks? Any robots?
No robots, but it was...
Fucking hell.
But it was on Netflix. Although, actually, no, the film I'm about to recommend does have one of the main characters is an AI, which is
It'll do.
Disembodied robot. Yeah, so listeners from last time might remember I was recommending the Netflix film Stowaway about a group of people travelling to another planet. And this week I have another film about people travelling to another planet. I don't know if there's a theme going on. Don't know if Elon Musk's space ventures has prompted a wave of pop culture films reflecting the process of going to other worlds. But I watched a French sci-fi film called Oxygen that I can strongly recommend. And it's about a woman who wakes up in a pod and she's kind of strapped into a lot of medical equipment and is confused, can't really remember what's going on, has some vague memories of like hospitals and medical stuff. She's in this pod with an AI that's sort of looking after her, but also sort of unhelpful in explaining what's going on. But then it does tell her that the oxygen level is running down, and if she can't open the pod or get oxygen from somewhere, she will die when the oxygen level hits zero. So it's a kind of claustrophobic, small space, race against time thriller. It's very good. It's very tense. Yeah, it's a film I strongly recommend.
So is this like full-on small space, a single pod film? She's stuck in just that pod for the entire film, or most of it?
Yeah, she's in the pod for almost the entire film. There are a few flashbacks and things that she tries to remember what happened before she ended up in the pod. The action, contemporary action, never leaves the pod, although she does get access to the pod's phone facility at some point so she can call people up and speak to them. It reminds me very much of a film that came out pretty much 10 years ago called Buried.
Very much the next thing I was going to mention, yeah.
Yeah, it's very similar, though. This one's French and in space rather than American and underground. There seemed to be a real wave of films. Pretty much about 10 years ago, people did these kind of, small cast, real-time films set in small spaces. There was Buried. There was a film called Exam about a group of people taking an exam, and it, again, all took place in real time, just in the exam room. I don't know what caused this wave. Maybe it was Saw, which was a huge hit, and Saw is largely two people in one room trying to solve puzzles. But this is a good addition to the subgenre.
Just to check and inform, Buried is the one with Ryan Reynolds in a coffin for the whole film, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Does indeed sound kind of similar to Stowaway in an enclosed space danger way.
Yeah.
Maybe they're coming back in.
I don't know if this is maybe also a product of films made during lockdown. I mean, actually, I don't know when these films were made, so they might have been made before or things like that. But I guess small casts that can be in a sort of a bubble and small number of sets is, I guess, a scaled down thing you can do during lockdown.
Well, yeah, that is the obvious way to avoid having to have people talk to each other, So Vanderbilt has looked up on the internet. Apparently, at one point, Anne Hathaway was in it or starring in it or something.
All right.
Yeah, no, there's no clear information about whether it was made during lockdown. Although it says that Anne Hathaway was added to the cast in July 2017. So if it's been in development for that long, I guess probably not. Well, to be fair, it did seem to pick up quite a lot of steam in 2020 and actually be filmed in 2020. So it is possible that it was, pulled off the pile as something we could film during lockdown.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly works. Small set, one performer, other people doing voice parts. Yeah, and I would recommend it. It's just quite an interesting, unusual film. It's got this kind of quite tightly controlled premise that it doesn't really stray from. There's some interesting twists along the way, which I won't spoil. But again, it's a classic, like all is not as it seems, especially as the character has lost her memory, so there's questions into like, who was she, how did she end up in the situation, what happened before, that are kind of teased out in a kind of satisfying way.
For some reason I was expecting there to be a capitalist oxygen angle, but then I realised I'm actually thinking about the Doctor Who episode Oxygen.
Yeah, a similar title.
Yeah.
No, but that's if you're looking for something to watch on Netflix, that's something I would recommend after you've finished Love, Death and Robots and The Mitchells vs. the Machine. But anyway, Nick, have you been watching any Netflix recently?
Actually, I am going to take us outside Netflix of us betraying our corporate sponsor and ensuring our assassination. Just kidding, legal team. Netflix do not give us any money. Yep, I read Friend of the Devil, a graphic novel by Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips, which came out within the last month, I think, within the last few weeks, which is a 80s set crime graphic novel about, well, as part of a sort of format experiment, again kind of prompted by monthly comics becoming a bit irregular during lockdown. The team of Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips have started working in this regular graphic novel format, and they've decided to create this sort of ongoing serialised detective character in a sort of pulp novel tradition, who they could just bring back at random intervals and pop in on at different points during his life. So they've got this new one set during the 80s, and the previous book, which was just called Relentless and came out towards the end of last year, which I think might have been set in the 70s. I mean, I've got it here, so I'll just look. The very early 80s. Okay, so about 4 years earlier. Anyway, so yeah, they've got this ongoing detective character who's just this guy, you know, with a troubled past who lives in a cinema watching old films and occasionally comes out to try and work as a sort of freelance fixer, like not a private detective, as he keeps telling us, but more just a guy who makes things right. They're bringing in some very sort of old school pulp stuff. There's just this tough guy who makes things right for money and deals with the baddies with his two-fisted approach. It's good, it's fun. There's a very... Because Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips have been doing sort of noir crime comics and other various slightly bleak stories about people who are completely fucked, basically. Either attempting to unfuck themselves and often in the process becoming more fucked. And yeah, it's a subgenre they're very good at, and there's, you know, lots of captions about him meeting people and saying things like, you know, it seemed nice at the time. Little did I know, now she was fucked. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of the sad man from the future revisiting his past and talking about how even the nice bits would ultimately lead to being fucked. Which probably makes it sound a bit more punishingly bleak than it is. It is a sort of fun adventure story, but it's got this very wry noir future narration going on. But yeah, they're a very strong team. They've been doing this a long time, and it's giving them a bit more space over the graphic novel format rather than forcing them to have like a beginning, middle, and end every 20 pages has led them to produce this interesting, more complicated narrative that they're doing here.
Sounds interesting, bringing in the film noir and the PI subgenre elements. But this is a straight up take. This isn't some kind of like ironic take on it, or are they doing sort of straight up film noir?
They're taking it relatively seriously, I think. There's not really any smug self-awareness. There's not any robots, or fantasy elements. Just a guy trying to make things right, one desperate person at a time. I think the idea is that, yeah, there's this sort of iconic protagonist thing, this sort of character who you can plug into any situation and who you can just keep dropping back in on, and whose stories you don't even really need to read in order. They're just this sort of iconic presence, which I think they quite like and want to try and get back to with this series of graphic novels. I think they've committed to doing like 5 of them, I think. I saw Brubaker say in an interview, just to see how it goes. And to be fair, that's quite a lot. So that'll probably keep him busy for at least a year or two.
Yeah, there's quite a commitment. Sounds good. I guess the good thing about the kind of a fixer or a PI character, one of the reasons why they appear so much in fiction is that it's a character that can suit almost any circumstance. You know, someone who goes and tries to fix things, puts their nose into other people's business is the kind of a useful character to get involved in like a wide range of stories.
He's set in Hollywood. I mean, I guess hence the sort of old cinema gimmick. The Friend of the Devil book I just read certainly has quite a lot of material about, you know, the dark side of old Hollywood. Well, obviously the title, Friend of the Devil. It's the satanic panic stuff and the sort of the vague idea of the small group of actual Satanists who might have existed and stuff like that.
Sounds interesting.
So yeah, it's fun. He's clearly done a fair bit of research and the art is great. The colours are surprisingly bright for a noir. You know, it's quite enjoyably sort of day glow and shiny sometimes, considering how fucked everyone is.
Yeah, the thematic sort of bleakness goes hand in hand with the sort of film noirness of it. But I suppose it's interesting that the colour palette isn't quite so sort of muted, because I suppose it provides some variety rather than just doing a sort of straight up, very iconic version of film noir.
Yeah, but it's set in sort of sunny LA, I guess, so... I mean, although to be fair, I watched 5 series of Angel, and they certainly found a lot of bleak shadows to lurk in LA, so...
Yeah, and we've read some Ed Brubaker comics for the podcast, haven't we?
But he's such an iconic creator that I wouldn't be at all surprised, but my shit's memory is entirely failing me.
I mean,
Friday, we read Friday, didn't we?
Yeah. One of the few comics that came out during lockdown.
Yeah, I think it was one of the first comics to emerge during lockdown. We read Friday, so I just went to our own website and searched, and the only other hit on his name is me mentioning Kill or Be Killed, another series he did with Sean Phillips in late 2018. Anyway, we read Friday during the start of lockdown. That's still coming out, slowly but surely. I think they've done 3 issues now. I have bought all of them on the pay what you want thing. I do need to go back and actually read them.
I suppose that's another mystery comic, so there's a genre connection there.
Well, yeah, as I think I said during our Friday review, he's a very crime guy, Ed Brubaker, although Friday was one where he dresses it up a bit with sort of YA Lovecraft influences rather than just doing dead straight noir. But yeah, if you are up for some sort of relatively straight Hollywood noir crime, then these Relentless books are the crime people at the peak of their game. It's good fun.
And from crime to death, or love, death, and robots. That segue didn't even work at all. Next up, this episode, we are discussing the second series of Love, Death and Robots from Netflix. This is an anthology show of animated short sci-fi films in a variety of styles and genres. There are 6 short films in the second series. Nick and I are going to count down our top 3 and see where we agree and what the best ones were. But before that, Nick, what did you think of the second series overall?
Yeah, I found it broadly enjoyable. I think when we covered the first one, I said it was an amazing range of animation and some interesting ranges of story style, although there was a slightly odd amount of naked and brutalised women in it. And they have definitely cut down on that, although they've also cut down on the range a bit, which I found a bit disappointing. I found that, I remember being genuinely blown away by some of the animation in the first volume of Love, Death and Robots. There was some stuff in there that was really exciting and really different to a lot of what you often see. This volume seemed quite dominated by the sort of quasi-realistic, vaguely video game cutscene style, which I was slightly disappointed by. I don't know, just because of the last volume, I came expecting to see exciting new kinds of animation, and there's a couple with fun styles, and we'll get to them. I didn't see anything that, blew my tiny mind. But the stories were mostly solid, although there was only a couple that really stood out. Like, we're only doing a top 3 instead of a 5 this time, because there's only 8 episodes instead of 18. But yeah, it wasn't that hard to cut it down to the main few for the top 3. It was, a lot of them were really okay, I thought.
Yeah, no, I can agree with all of that. I did thought it was strange that they've just really stuck to one style. I mean, there are a few that were a bit more stylized, but they've really gone for that photorealistic CGI, which is, I don't know, the kind of the oddness of it was kind of one of the appeals the last time, how they had this range of different styles and range of different genres. This time I felt there was more of the same animation and more of a kind of bleak dystopias. Like, I know there were less funny ones, although there were some funny ones, so they were more sort of just straight up kind of action adventure ones. I don't know if they got some feedback that was what people liked from the first series, so they've done more of that, or if people just didn't like how sort of tonally inconsistent the first series was, and they wanted to give it more of a collective feel. But I think something of the kind of the piecemeal nature is what kind of made it special. I mean, if you want to watch shows like an anthology sci-fi show that's got a consistent bleak sort of tone, there's plenty of Black Mirror for you to watch.
Yeah, it's true. Although I remember the first volume being a bit more consistently sci-fi, whereas this one definitely veered into fantasy a fair bit, especially towards the end of the order I watched them in, which was whatever the default order was on my Netflix. Yeah,
because last time they had the innovation, which is they released 2 different orders, and supposedly Netflix used your viewing preferences to order them, one way or the other, although I don't know if that's how much of that was actually confirmed or just suspected. But this time it just appears to be there are 8, they're presented in one order. Somewhere.
Yeah, I've not seen much speculation. Though, to be fair, I've not seen much discussion in general. I'm not sure this has really made many waves. Yeah, it's fine. I liked a few of them. I didn't find watching it as a whole overly interesting. I mean, there's a couple of these which are really just fantasy, entirely just fantasy with no hard sci-fi whatsoever. But as I remember the first volume, maybe sticking in that wheelhouse a bit more. But it's been so long since I watched it, that might just be bollocks.
Yeah, I mean, Tall Grass is the episode that's pretty much a sort of horror fantasy story. The final one, The Drowned Giant, is a sort of fantasy story.
And All Through the House.
Yeah.
I guess the best of varying levels of sci-fi.
Each episode pretty much contains the theme of either love, death, or robots. But that's a very, very broad net to cast. Sometimes I always think that by calling it Love, Death, and Robots, it really can make the story about anything, especially if it only contains one of those things rather than all 3.
Well, I mean, if anything, I feel like they've overcommitted to robots on occasion, or at least to vague tech, because some of the sci-fi tech stories were, to me, some of the most slightly generic. To get vaguely into specifics, there was a couple here which were some of the slightly longer ones, Snow in the Desert, but attempted to do what felt like a slightly summarized whole action movie in a short story, which just didn't feel that satisfying to me.
Yeah, I think it's short stories short films, I always feel there's kind of 2 approaches, and one is just basically like you say, take something that could be conceivably a film and pack it down as much as possible, which is what they've tried with a story like Snow in the Desert, which is basically means you kind of, by stripping things out, you're left with the bare bones of what is a fairly generic story of a bounty hunter being hunted by goons with guns and sci-fi gear, and then someone protecting them. It's not breaking new ground's originality, because if you're going to tell that story in a longer format, you could bring bring in interesting takes on it, but maybe not so much in the short space. And then the other one is the approach is kind of just to do like a scene. So something like a piece of a story, or like, just what is clearly, a moment itself, such as there's the first one was an automated customer service. It's kind of basically a sort of self-contained action scene that could be the opening of a larger story, or just like a sort of a scene in itself. But yeah, the less interesting ones were the ones when they try to like boil a big story down to like a short space of time, and it leaves to stripping out individuality and only putting in sort of generic stories.
Yeah, pretty much. I think a lot of the ones I liked, as we'll be discovering shortly, were the ones that just basically boiled something down to a single scene. Although, having said that, my favourite one, still talking desperately around the actual details, was a bit more of a sweeping, broad thing. So we'll see.
Right. Shall we proceed to the ranking as we're getting into details? We can always go into discussing some of the other episodes after we've kind of done our comparison.
Yeah, sure. Why not? Okay. So, yeah, you introduced it. Shall I go first with the ranking?
Yep, go for it.
Okay, my number 3 was Life Hutch, which is a short survival piece, basically, about a soldier fighting a robot in close quarters. And yeah, of all the realistically animated fighty sci-fi ones, this was probably my favourite. This was the one that, because it was just focusing on this sort of short story of this guy fighting for survival, with a few vague hints about wider context, but nothing that really got over-explained. Yeah, I quite enjoyed this for whatever reason. It caught me at the right time. I got quite invested in the man and his survival. It was a nicely choreographed fight. It was actually quite scary and close quarters intimidating. The choreography felt quite controlled. I always had a clear idea of what was going on. It's not doing anything brilliantly innovative. There's probably other ones with more interesting ideas and more interesting animation, but I found this one more riveting.
I did enjoy Life Hutch. It hasn't made my top 3, but it is one of the ones that I thought was very good. Yeah, you're absolutely right. The close quarters, claustrophobia, the action scenes, all very good. It's one of the ones that had some of the more unpleasant moments. I do like a story that makes you squirm a bit, and kind of when someone gets like their hand crushed or something like that, you really feel the pain of it. So yeah, it was very vivid, which I really liked.
Yeah, there's a nice sort of weird reversal where you almost feel bad for the antagonist robot towards the end, even though it's been hunting this bloke throughout the whole thing. It's nicely done.
Yeah. So my number 3, my third favourite, is All Through the House, which is one of the sillier ones. Yeah, one of the few that kind of diverges from the tone of grim dystopia. This is one about 2 children who come downstairs at Christmas time and they think they have heard Santa Claus delivering presents, and they have, and I don't really know how to describe this, but Santa is not as advertised.
Yeah, I enjoyed this as well. This was very much an honourable mention for me, probably my 4th behind Life Hutch.
Yeah, it's funny. It's very much all builds up to kind of the last sentence of it, which kind of delivers a kind of knockout joke. And it did really make me laugh. It did make me really think like, wow, that was unexpected. It's the sort of thing that really, it could almost be like a sketch in a sketch show. It's just it's got one joke, but it does it very well.
Yeah, it's a good execution of one joke. But to be fair, it's only 5 minutes long, or something like that. So it's not as if we could really moan about it, dragging out its one joke. It very much gets in, does it, and gets out. And it does animate that joke, which we're talking desperately around revealing, very beautifully and carefully.
Yeah, it is funny, and it's only 7 minutes long. It's by way the shortish, so if you can just go and watch that if you just want to laugh for 5 minutes.
Yeah, as Alistair said, they very much changed the animation style to play into this whole sort of kids at Christmas, kids animation thing, which plays into the eventual reveal, which I'm still not going to reveal.
Yeah, it's best if you don't know going in.
Yeah. Okay, and number 2 then for me, and leaving the sci-fi world behind, with The Tall Grass, a short horror story about a man who steps off his train for a cigarette because it's stopped in the middle of a field of tall grass, and finds himself lured out into the grass and hunted by a mysterious creature. Yet another one where a guy is hunted in a very sort of tense and unnerving way, and it seems that's just what I'm after at the moment. I just want to get back out into the world, out of quarantine, out of my house, into the world, so I can be hunted down by some sort of monster. That's what I really want. But yeah, my personal desires aside, I really enjoyed this as well. It sucks me in. And the animation felt sort of interestingly different. It had a vaguely sort of painterly sheen over it. I'm not artist enough to describe it in luscious detail, but it had a sort of slightly soft, different tone to some of the more rubbery CGI realness of some of the others. So yeah, and again, it really sucked me in. It had a nice sort of Lovecraftian vibe to it. Enjoyed.
Yeah, this is one that I really liked as well. It very narrowly missed out on being in my top 3. I think it was just pitched to the post by All Throughout the House. But I did like it. It was generally quite scary. It was very entertaining. Yeah, it was quite twisted and dark. which was good. And it almost felt like a painting, this kind of very stylized, quite rich textures and colours, and it really kind of evoked the odd world that the story was sort of set in. Very good, very tense.
Yeah, I'm not enough of a Lovecraftologist to know if this is actually meant to be a shout out to a specific Lovecraft story, or if the main character is meant to be Lovecraft or some sort of iconic Lovecraft protagonist, but I did get the feeling it might have been leaning in that direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very much of that style, again, with unspeakable, nameless horrors living out in the beyond. It's kind of, it's also set, well, although it's not specific, but from the clothes and the train, they're travelling on a train, and it's an old steam train of a quite specific type. You get the feeling it's from that kind of turn of the 20th century period where, like, you know, sort of Lovecraft was writing, or, you know, shortly thereafter. So it's definitely vibing along those lines.
Yeah, so yeah, no, I felt this. Again, much like Live Hutch, I was very much glued to my screen.
Cool. Well, my second favourite was the final one of the 8, The Drowned Giant. This is a story about a scientist, though not really specified what he specifically studies, who arrives at a beach after the enormous naked corpse of a giant washes up, and he sits there and watches it and watches the people who kind of come to pretty much gawk at the giant drowned man. And it's kind of just really quite sad, although most of them have got this sort of dystopian tone, but this one's got this kind of, although it's in that kind of dark and sort of quite sad tone, but it's of a piece, but it's kind of got its very much its own feeling. I'm probably not describing this well enough, but the mood was quite specific and quite rich, this kind of sad loss of life story about this poor guy, you know, who drowned, but we don't know where he came from, and there's very little explanation. I was kind of worried they'd ruin it by having some like big reveal at the end, or some kind of expanded out into this bigger story about giant life living in the bottom of the sea or something. But no, it's just this kind of sad story about this mysterious corpse that washes up and then kind of gets carved up just because people like to own bits of things that are weird. And yeah, I just kind of really dug the tone of it, the gentle melancholy.
Yes, no, I really like this. In fact, I'll just cut through now and say this was my number 1, so my number 3 countdown is effectively over. Yeah, this was my favourite. I quite liked the sort of gentle sadness of it. It reminded me a bit of The Dig in a weird way, the film we covered the other week. The sort of soft focus British exploration of old things and what they mean, and admittedly this was, as I said, a bit more sort of sad and melancholy than The Dig often was. And also, in a weird way, as well as this sort of soft focus British village stuff, some quite almost off-puttingly grim moments as this giant body is sort of chopped up for parts, because I guess how else are you going to move it? And yeah, it's well written, it was thoughtful. Again, it was not really quite what I'd expect from this anthology. I don't actually know if it's based on a prose short story. I gather some of these sometimes are, but it very much felt like it might be. It had a very careful, thoughtful tone, which I enjoyed. Out of place sounding British accents, as you often get in American productions. And British cars with number plates that do not look legal.
Yeah, and the clothing kind of style sort of see similar to like the Dig as well, the kind of the suits and things that the people are wearing. Most of the story is like told as voiceover from the character's perspective, so I can imagine how you could write this as a short story. I mean, you could just read the character's voiceover without the visuals and it would sort of work. So yeah, I can see how this would be like adapted from short story if it was.
It is getting into narrated montage territory, but having said that, I still thought it worked really well. So yeah, this was my personal favourite. This sat with me for a few minutes after I watched it.
Yeah, it was very good. And yeah, just narrowly beaten to second place by my personal favourite was the second of the 8 films, which is Ice. This is set on a future on a strange planet where they're kind of extracting minerals or things from a giant frozen ice sheet. People seem to be augmented in some way. Some teenagers have this, I guess, kind of, I don't know, just kind of hobby thing they do just while they're wasting time, of kind of running across the ice as it breaks when a whale comes to the surface. The story and necessarily the setting aren't necessarily breaking new grounds in terms of sci-fi, but I thought I just really like the visual style of this one. It's really got this sort of dark, bleak, cold aesthetic. You really feel how cold it is out on the ice, and there's just all these shots of these kind of enormous crane structures in the background extracting, you know, who knows what from this planet. There's just a kind of cold grimness to it that I kind of dug, that was expressed very well by the visuals.
Yeah, I must admit, this wasn't entirely a contender for me, but I do agree it probably had the most interesting animation of all of them. Yeah, no, this probably did have the most memorable animation of anything here. This was a very cool style. I wasn't massively sucked in by the story, which is, I guess, why it's not on my list, but I do agree this was definitely the visual standout. Yeah,
it's one of the few that doesn't use the video game cutscene photorealistic CGI approach.
I was quite excited after the first 2, because this and the first one, automated customer service, which is quite a standard story, to be honest, like very standard, but does have a sort of a cool stylized animation thing going on. Like the way it does the people with their huge heads and their little arms is quite funny.
Yeah.
And so after that and then Ice, I was a bit sort of, okay, you know, none of these stories have really blown my mind yet, but at least there's some interesting animation. And after that, the animation went a bit flat.
Yeah, that's very much how I felt. After the first two, you're like, wow, there's two films with very different tones, styles, and genres. And I thought, like, okay, so this is going to be an interesting, diverse range of things. And then the next two are fairly generic dystopian future action films with photorealistic CGI. And at that point, I was like, oh, maybe it was just those first two. And it kind of continues in that vein. Although ending with the Drowned Giant is very nice because it has certainly a different tone.
Now, that was a good choice. That was a nice bit of sequencing. It's very much got that sort of thoughtful epilogue, last track ballad, slow, thoughtful ending thing going on. Although, you know, having slightly slandered the animation on episodes 3 and 4, I thought Pop Squad was quite a nice story, even if the animation was a bit, again, yeah, standard. I did feel emotions whilst watching Pop Squad. It didn't quite make my top 3, but it was. I didn't hate it. It was my other honourable mention on my list.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I guess it's similar to what you were talking about. They're very much doing the straight-up, hard-boiled detective thing. I quite like the fact that everyone in that universe seems to dress as a hard-boiled detective, whether they're men or women. Everyone just wears like a trilby hat and a trench coat, and then stands around in the rain. Everyone's absorbed the vibe. I see we're all doing the same thing. But yeah, that's another one that I think takes like what could be like a film and kind of presses it down into a sort of self-contained story. I thought, yeah, possibly again more interesting if it was like a whole film because it could have dug more into the moral quandaries of it. But it's a hard one not to be moved by. I mean, it's probably again the twist sort of unfolds. So it's probably best not spoiling it, but you have to have a heart of stone not to be moved by this kind of quite dystopian story.
Well, yeah, that's mostly it, I think. I think they pulled off the ending in a way that at least got the feeling across. Yeah, even if it's in some ways quite a standard noir dystopian ending. Yeah,
so I think we've touched on all of them. That gives you an appraisal of the whole series.
Yeah, there's definitely some good bits in there. You know, I think across our various top 3s, I think we've covered about 5 of them between us. So yeah, you know, we enjoyed kind of a majority of it. But yeah, I must admit I wasn't as blown away by a lot of them as I maybe hoped to be.
There wasn't one that was totally like floored me of like, this one is brilliant. Like in the first series, there's one, was it called Blue Square? That I think we both kind of chose as our favourite. And that one was clearly like, wow, that was just really, really good. There was just, this really, really like element of like, this is really, really awesome. And there wasn't one in this series. You know, I think that has that quantity.
I don't know, The Drowned Giant did do a lot for me, but it wasn't quite that brilliant, and the rest of it was very standard genre story to various levels of effectiveness. Nothing quite elevated itself.
Yeah, I feel the fact that we've chosen slightly different favourites probably means there wasn't one that just kind of really nailed it, because we'd have probably both gone for that one. Yeah, The Drowned Giant was very, very good, and yeah, I think it seems to be a favourite amongst the two of us.
Well, yes, if we were doing a unified MFV chart, I guess that's the winner. Yeah, I gather they've already made another run of 8 to put out as Volume 3, so who knows, we'll be back doing this in a year or two.
Finally, this episode, we will be reviewing The Mitchells vs. The Machines, a new animated sci-fi comedy from Netflix. The Mitchells are a dysfunctional family of oddballs who can't put their electronic devices away for 5 minutes. Their daughter, Katie Mitchell, loves to make weird movies online and is excited about escaping her family to study filmmaking at college. However, her outdoorsy dad, Rick, wants to spend more quality family time together, so he arranges a family drive across the country to take Katie to college. Meanwhile, technology company PAL is unveiling its latest range of household robots, and its personal manager AI goes rogue. PAL takes control of these robots and smart machines to imprison humanity, leaving the dysfunctional Mitchells as the only people left who can save the world. We saw this recently, so Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, no, I really like this. Most people on Twitter seem to agree, but yeah, this was a lot of fun. It was deeply committed to its own silliness in a way I really envy. I believe it's produced by the guys who directed Spider-Verse, and there's some comparisons here in terms of visual style, but even that movie seems to try for narrative heaviness in a way that this one doesn't. The plot makes sense, but it's just very manic and silly and seems very happy to just stop and go off on bits, which pretty much always land. There's a lot of jokes, and they hit with a density that I very much approve of. Not that the emotions don't work, but they're very much in small scenes pocketed between the silliness, which I kind of appreciate. You know, it's a different tone to the sort of the Pixar tone. The Pixar films, I think, possibly go in a bit more for the heaviness in order to elicit a bit more sobbing from the adults, whereas The Mitchells vs. The Machines does hit the emotion, but is a lot happier to be a lot sillier, which makes it very enjoyable and very different and very fun. So yeah, I liked this a lot. It's a good film. This was an extremely enjoyable thing to spend one of my dark lockdown evenings watching.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this film as well, and I've not met anyone who's not seen this film and not only liked it but loved it. You know, it is very, very funny and very, very good. What I like most about it, and I think what made it really work, is that the tone was just perfect that they aimed for. They kind of they brought the surrealness and weirdness of internet humour into a family movie about, an animated regular family aimed at a mainstream audience. Obviously, the main character is someone who kind of creates animation online and is kind of schooled in internet humor, but that kind of, I guess she kind of narrates the film, so her sensibility is brought into the whole look and feel of the film. Bizarre kind of Dada inflected, weird kind of internet humor style is kind of brought across but in this kind of warm, family friendly, funny way. They really did nail that internet humor. Felt maybe a bit more sort of early to mid aughts internet humour. Again, the sort of more Dada inflected bizarreness, which I don't know if internet humour's kind of moved on from that a bit, but they really nailed that tone and then told a story that was really sweet and funny. So that's what I think really made it work.
I mean, a lot of people I know like this, but obviously a lot of people I know are my age, i.e. in their mid to late 30s. So part of me would be curious to hear what the actual kids think of this, but I probably never will. So who knows, but I enjoy it. The level of internet humour involved very much hits for me.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of younger people, it does have a lot of the humour of the kind of the well-trodden school of CGI characters pulling weird faces, which obviously aimed at the younger, especially animals and non-human characters pulling weird faces. School of humour that's appeared in everything from Shrek through to Pixar films. So there is a broad spectrum of humour. It's not just internet dada.
Well, yeah, crucially, it gets the feeling of internet humour, but it's not just, look, we said the thing, or look, here's that meme you remember. It's actually funny.
Yeah, they've kind of taken the style and approach and applied it to a family comedy film. Especially, and also they dial it up and down. Some bits when you see Katie's actual animations are much more kind of internet humour. There's one bit when she's got a video of her dog vomiting a smaller version of the dog that vomits a smaller version of the dog in a kind of endless loop that just kind of flashed on screen for a minute, and you're just like, that was bizarrely brilliant.
Well, yeah, a lot of it is the sort of manicness, the way it sort of goes from one bit to another bit like that, all of which basically work, which, is a high level of quality I could appreciate. I mean, there's a lot going on in this film, including about, 7, 8 primary characters? Primary to secondary sort of characters who actually have some sort of story and some sort of joke, which I guess adds to how manic it is. A lot of animated films would have just the funny dog or the weird broken robots, but The Mitchells vs. the Machines goes all in and has both, and gives them both a little story arc.
Yeah, I mean, you can tell how much is going on in this film by how long it took me just to give a basic introduction. You kind of had to explain the family dynamic and the broader dynamic of the world and the plot. It's both a family story about a family, that's kind of under stress as people are going in different directions, but also a sci-fi film about, robots enslaving the world. There is a lot going on, but the characters are really front and centre, which I think is what makes it work as well. And the characters are all great. And as you say, each character has their joke or sort of strand of humour that's brought to the floor, but also they've got strong personalities and you really kind of get a sense of each character. So I think that what makes what is quite a complex film for, I guess one that's aimed primarily at children. It's quite complicated, but it does work because it's always based on these characters. And it doesn't go long before doing something really silly.
Well, yeah, it's maybe a bit longer than you'd expect from one of these animated films, as it's got to, service every character. But yeah, it gets around them, and thus it has the sort of big crowd-pleasing action sequences every so often to distract from getting around the characters. There's a nice sense of escalation from a little standoff in a lay-by to the shopping centre to the big evil base fight at the end. So yeah, I think it sort of ramps up nicely and keeps the structure going despite having to service all this. I don't know, it seems futile to name individual jokes. The climax of the big shopping centre fight in the middle was absolutely great, but there's a lot of good stuff in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of epic jokes. I think you're right, there's a real consistent kind of raising of stakes, but also raising of silliness and tension throughout, building to the finale. Yeah, the finale is the best bit of the film, where it brings everything together, the emotional bits, the action, the comedy, the best joke, so pretty much in the last bit. The sweetest moments are in the last bit. And there's a kind of consistent build-up, which I do really like.
And yeah, and the character arcs stay easy to track. I mean, it has these 8, is it 8? It's something like 8 characters. But to be honest, a lot of them are fairly secondary or slightly more two-dimensional. It's the dad and the daughter are clearly the main characters. It's clearly about their relationship. Everyone else is in there and has a personality, but they're the main characters, and it keeps its eyes on that, which I think makes it keep going even if it gets a bit manic. I don't know, I think what's fun about it is it does a good job of seeming wildly out of control, whereas you kind of know that behind the scenes it's been intricately planned beat by beat, second by second. It ends up feeling like the thing it's portraying, which is this sort of out of control road trip slamming wildly down the road, but in reality it's I think pretty artfully put together.
No, exactly. I mean, it's difficult with all these moving components because, like you say, there's a story about Katie going to university, not fitting in with her family, especially not fitting in with her dad, who's the opposite of her, who's kind of outdoorsy and things like that. And there's, her relationship with her brother, her relationship with her mother. And that's before we even get to the storyline about the rogue AI taking over robots and, getting into stuff about tech companies. And again, the tech stuff relates back to the family, because one of the family dynamics is that they all can't put away their mobile devices and are just constantly on tablets, smartphones, computers doing things.
Which, could be a bit of a rote observation in a post-Black Mirror world, but it's so charmingly done here, but it doesn't really matter, It's about the execution rather than the ideas, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, one of my criticisms are, I don't have many criticisms, but one of the is that, like, at times it sort of does stray into this Black Mirror-esque, or even the kind of stereotype of Black Mirror, which is like, oh, phones are bad, like, what if phones, but too much? Kind of things like, oh, like, isn't the world terrible because we just, like, stare at our phones rather than talk to each other? It goes into moments like that. I mean, I guess, I don't know, again, like, it is aimed at a broad audience, and it is, trying to do a lot, and it does work partly because it's so rooted in the characters, and it does have a really sweet story you want to tell about characters, about, family. As you develop your own personality, what happens if they don't mesh with your family? How do you be yourself, but also be a part of a unit like a family? Part of being a parent is your children growing up and growing away from you and leaving, both emotionally and obviously physically, in the sense of going to college. So it's dealing with these, like, big emotional issues, and it really invests them with heart, and you feel for the characters. And it's not that, like, Katie just wants to be herself and her parents are, like, overbearing. Everyone's is relatable, and it's very sweet and emotional. So the family story works so well, I'm willing to forgive them a bit of kind of, as you say, rote observations about, phones are stopping our ability to talk to each other.
Well, yeah, like every so often there's a bit where I think at one point the dad is talking to the big tech boss character, and he says, oh my god, what if it turns out surrendering all our data to this massive corporation was a bad idea? It's like, well, that is a fairly blatant statement of the moral of the story, but, it's only one line and it's a children's film, so whatever.
Yeah, it was straight up staying the political kind of message of the film, which is, I think, believe you, almost at one point they say, like, they do say something like tech companies are dangerously unregulated. It's, like you say, it's aimed at children, but part of me actually, as well as I just criticised it for maybe being a bit too obvious, I also did kind of like how it, like, just did totally, like, go for it. It was like, like, big tech companies that are out of control are bad. And, like, it didn't do I don't know, like, we don't want to, like, offend conservative people or, like, get accused of being, like, a preachy liberal film. I mean, this is, like, a film produced by, like, a massive animation studio and released on, like, Netflix, one of the world's, like, biggest, like, tech platforms. So they are sort of having their cake and eating it. But I did like partly how, like, straight up they were with, like, the political message. They didn't pull their punches in that regard. So that, I guess you can not pull your punches and you can be too obvious. I mean, it's a difficult tightrope to walk, but the film at least is interesting in the way it does that.
Well, I think, like a lot of the things it does it in quite a sort of quick, manic way. Like, yes, it sometimes blatantly states the moral, but it does it in one line, and it gets back to the dog licking people and farting or something.
Yeah, there'll always be something, something silly.
It's not as if there's, like, a 10-minute speech where the dad turns straight to the camera and delivers the moral of the story.
Yeah. And it's always this kind of the same sense of humour that's just really infectiously silly and funny, and, like, adding things like sort of like what appears to be like hand-drawn animation sort of bits, like puffs of smoke or whatever that come out of people's head, or like light bulbs and things like that, on top of the CGI animation, kind of mixing of styles, which was very funny.
Yeah, there was a weird sort of stylistic thing where when you saw people on phone screens, they looked photorealistic at times. Although possibly not at other times. It was very strange. I don't think this is even a consistency complaint, because I think if I tried to lay into this film for not being entirely visually consistent, it would probably just make a fart noise at me. So, whatever.
I kind of interpreted that as also possibly the influence of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, in that, a film that really, in quite a clever way, mixed lots of quite different visual and animation styles together into what felt like a consistent film. And they've done a similar thing in a less obvious way with this, like how you're kind of seeing everything from, like, Katie's perspective, and she's narrating it after the fact, so you can almost imagine, like, so it's her mind who's adding in, like, these very cartoony bits of, like, the light bulb that appears above, like, her father's head or whatever at one point is, if it was sound, it would be what's described as non-diegetic. It's not supposed to be something the characters can see in the moment. It's something like her perspective is kind of adding later. But in order to differentiate the two, kind of what's actually in the world and what's the film's observation of itself, they've used different animation styles, which kind of makes it obvious. It's quite a technical and wordy way to describe what you can see quite clearly on the screen. I don't know if that made sense or that was just a weird rant.
Yeah, no, I think that just about made sense. And yeah, I think there's definitely a bit of post-Spider-Verseism here, although obviously I'm not plugged in enough to Hollywood cycles to know if this has actually been in development for decades before Spider-Verse was. But yeah, I think it's definitely got the same sense of manic uses of different animations to signify different levels of reality. Although Spider-Verse was, I guess, doing that more literally.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this might be the best animated film I've seen since Into the Spider-Verse, to be honest.
Absolutely, and it's jumped straight into my list of best films seen so far this year. Absolutely loving it. And I mean, I could just keep praising the film indefinitely, but one other thing I did want to single out is that I really like the voice cast as well. The character and the animation is really nice, but the voice cast brings it really to life. Like Katie's voiced by Abby Jacobson, who was Bean in Disenchantment, doing a sort of similar voice. We've got Maya Rudolph from The Good Place as the mum. Eric Andre, who's the American comedian, is very good in this. Olivia Colman, British national treasure, playing the rogue AI.
That was funny.
Yeah, she's very good. The sort of kind of riffing on the fact that all AI personal assistants seem to have these soft, inoffensive women's voices. So yeah, Olivia Colman's kind of perfect for that. Conan O'Brien as well, of Simpsons and his own chat show. So yeah, the voice cast is very strong.
Yeah, I did read somewhere this was meant to be released under the title Connected. Glad that didn't happen.
I guess it kind of sums up the themes of the film, both family connection and internet connection and technology connection, but I don't know.
It's a bit of a jarring title. I mean, I don't know, I'm sure we'd have lived with it, but it jars a bit against the style of the film.
It does, yeah. And The Mitchells versus the Machines sums the film up very well because, again, it has these two elements to it. There's the Mitchell family dynamic, and then there's the plot about the robots taking over the world. Those are the two sort of main elements to the film. I mean, they could have just done a film about a dysfunctional family driving across America and the awkwardness of that, and you find out more about the father and his backstory and the kind of the way he is, and you explore the characters. I mean, and that would have just been a funny, entertaining film in itself. But they've also got a sci-fi action silly plot on top of that. Yeah, as we said before, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah, no, big fan.
Yeah. So I'd certainly strongly recommend this. And if if you're someone who doesn't want to watch a children's film, there's something for everyone to like here, and it is very funny, and the feel of the memes and things like that they kind of bring into it, as well as the family story, really does work. Like I say, it's kind of dropped straight into my list of best things that have been released this year. So if you're sitting on the fence, do go for it.
I agree. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much for listening. If you want yet more of this brand of content, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find our other episodes, occasional bits of bonus audio, and various bits and pieces, both by Alistair about films and TV he's seen, and by Tom Coley about the albums of our teenage years. And if you want to reward us for all this hard work, you can go to the podcast outlet of your choice and leave us a nice review. Thank you very much.
You can also find more of us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast. And you can also find more of us on Facebook by visiting facebook.com/moderate fantasy violence. You can find more from me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, or you can visit my website, which is redtrainblog.com.
And you can find more from me at nickbryan.com, or you can go to @nickmb on Twitter to find out more about my tiny self-published writing empire, including probably more comics in the medium-ish term future. Or you can come back even sooner, in 2 weeks, to hear the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, in which we'll be covering Army of the Dead, the new movie on Netflix, yes again, by Zack Snyder, yes again. And then we'll also be doing The Nevers, the new TV show, I think begun by Joss Whedon and then continued after his departure. Sadly not by Zack Snyder, though that would have been ironically quite funny. So anyway, we'll see you in 2 weeks for that. Goodbye.
Bye.
Oh yeah, that's mostly it, I think. I think they pulled off the ending at the end. The ending at the end. Yeah.